Confronting, give me the thumbs up. We're good to go. Okay, so we are officially welcoming everyone. So welcoming, good morning. So before we turn things over to our lecturer, I'm trying to give some context. So again, good morning to our Caldwell University students, faculty, staff, to our community members, and to our colleagues from other institutions. We are all excited that you all are joining us today. My name is Abdul Staten, and I am the director of our Office of Student Advocacy and Prevention Awareness here at Caldwell University. Our office aspires to be a community, rather to create a community where safe, healthy, consensual relationships flourish. In our work, we center the voices of survivors of sexual and intimate partner violence, and we pay concerted efforts to center survivors from marginalized communities. So with that, I wanted to take a moment to help us all contextualize the event. So on our campus, we have two ongoing needs, right? So on the one hand, we have a need of working towards becoming actively anti-racist. We also have a need to actively pursue and then do advocacy, prevention, awareness, and response for sexual violence, right? So again, on the one hand, there's a need for us to learn about racism, but also to actively practice anti-racism, right? And so those two intersections leads us to this event today. And so while we may not have a large indigenous population, we acknowledge that white supremacy structures that affect Native people also affect other marginalized groups. And we also acknowledge that we don't, quite frankly, need a large indigenous populations to want to learn more about their communities and learn more about ways that we can become allies, advocates, and activists for them. And so before I turn things over to our facilitator, or rather our lecturer, I wanted to share just a few more quick tidbits. First, given the nature of this work, where we continually explore, topics of sexual violence, intimate partner violence, trauma, harm, and the like, there are bound to be instances today where we need to disassociate or maybe take a few minutes for ourselves or otherwise practice self-care. And so while we won't have a typical break during the lecture, we do encourage you all to step away from your screen, find that cute puppy meme, or whatever way that makes sense for you to practice self-care. And to help with that, in the chat, we're going to be placing some contact information for our local and national organizations. And Sarah was kind enough to provide us with an organization that specifies in Indigenous communities. Secondly, the session is being recorded in the weeks ahead, and then we're going to make that available on our YouTube channel. And I'll also put a link for that in our chat as well. We're going to keep people muted for the entirety of the lecture component. And then after that, we're going to open things up for a chat or some Q&A. So if you have a question that you want to ask, you can save it for the end, or you can put it in our chat box, right? And then we'll comb through that throughout the session, throughout the lecture, and then ask those questions. I'd also like to thank, as a last point, our co-sponsors, and those are our university's offices of counseling services, the Office of Student Engagement, as well as our fabulous community partner, State of Essex County, who is our local sexual violence program. We are really grateful for all your partnerships and contributions, and embracing our vision of centering survivors from marginalized populations. So with that, I wanted to just kind of share a brief background about our speaker for today. Again, her name is Justice Sarah Deer. She is a distinguished professor at the University of Kansas and a Chief Justice for the Prairie Island Indian Community Court of Appeals. Her work focuses on issues pertaining to violent crime on indigenous reservations. Her legal scholarship focuses on the challenges facing tribal nation in the United States, particularly criminal justice. As a tribal jurist and scholar, Justice Deer's scholarship focuses on the intersections of federal Indian law and victim rights, using indigenous principles as a framework. Sarah is a co-author of 4 textbooks on tribal law. She's been published in a wide variety of law journals. She has testified before Congress regarding violence against Native women and was appointed by Attorney General Eric Holder to chair a federal advisory committee on sexual violence in Indian country. She's been featured in several documentaries related to sexual violence in indigenous communities, which I'll put some of those in the chat today. She was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame, and we are very excited that she's joining us today. So I'm going to mute myself now and turn things over to Sarah.
All right, well, hello. Thank you very, very much for having me. Sexual Assault Month tends to be a very busy month for me because of my focus in scholarship on sexual violence and Native communities. But I'm really, really glad to be here. And what I'm going to do right now is share attempt again to share my screen, which has my PowerPoint. And you are more than welcome to take a picture of a slide or otherwise capture information. I don't feel a lot of like ownership over this material since I rely on a lot of other scholars too. I will also make the PowerPoint available for distribution by the administrators on the call today. Yeah, with that, I'm going to try my best to not do that and do this. Okay. Are you seeing my PowerPoint? I can't see you, so.
I do not
No.
see that.
Okay. This is screen one. Sorry, I have two monitors, which usually is a good thing, but not when I'm trying to do this. So let me try this again. I'm going to share screen one. I'm going to do this. We just did this, so, you know, okay. Screen one. There we go. Does that look right?
Yes, that does.
Okay, sorry. I don't know why two monitors are very helpful, but not when I'm trying to show PowerPoint on one slide and not the other. So again, thank you very much. I'm very honored to be invited to give this presentation to you today. I'm a lawyer, so a lot of my vantage point for this issue is coming from the law. But I want to acknowledge that law is not the end-all be-all of ending sexual violence as we know it in the United States. So keep in mind, we have a number of other disciplines that do amazing things, whether they're social workers or they're psychologists or counselors or they're activists. There's a lot of different vantage points in which this issue can be raised. So I will begin by just giving you a sense of the nature of my presentation today. It's interesting that this presentation in particular kind of is parallel to my own journey on this path to understand this issue. And it tends to go a little bit on a roller coaster, which is also very similar to my career, high points and low points. And so I hope to talk about some history, some statistics, and then I end on a more positive note. So I have some difficult material to talk about, but we will end on a positive note with the amazing things that are being done by both Native and non-Native activists to address the crisis that we face in Indian country. So that's sort of the table of contents, I guess, for my presentation. So I start out with some statistics, and I think that it's really important to understand the scope and extent of the problem that's faced in tribal communities, both reservation and urban tribal communities. So I'm going to be sharing with you a couple of slides that have statistics on them. I do this with some trepidation because, of course, human beings are not statistics. And what stats tend to do is often to dehumanize a crisis. But I do think it's important, especially if you're new to this area, that you're familiar with this data. Now, I'm going to show you some data that's 2016 it was released. It's actually an official government document, so it's a federal document that's based on research that was funded by the federal government. So this is not some activists that are inflating, the numbers or anything along those lines. And I wanted to also make a point of talking about the language that we use to talk about Native people. There's Indian, there's American Indian, there's Native American, there's Native, Indigenous, First Nations. And I like to joke sometimes that you could put, 10 Native people in a room and they'd come out with 12 different opinions on the correct labeling of our people, right? And so I tend, just so you know, I tend to use the word Indian maybe more than others because all of the laws that govern Indian country are always labeled Indian, and it's a mistake, right? Because we weren't from India when the Europeans arrived, but it's been so long used in the law, and it's in the Supreme Court cases that we work on, that sometimes I tend to talk about Indians, which makes some people uncomfortable, particularly people from Canada. And there's wide regional differences in the ways in which people talk about sort of the collective identity of tribal people in the United States. So I apologize if I offend anyone by my use of Indian. I also use Native a lot. There's not really a right or wrong answer. And so if you're working with somebody who's Native or you're working on a project, just the nicest thing to do is just to ask the preference of the person, because even within a family, there are differences of opinion. So this is the data that tells us what the federal government has found through victimization surveys. So if we think about how do we count sexual assault, because a long time ago, the way that we calculated the extent of crime in any given community is to count the number of police reports that were filed. And that was the way, our government tracked crime and tracked increases and decreases in crime. Now we know that most victims of violent crime don't report to the police. And so if we rely solely on police reports, we are missing the vast majority of assaults. So what victimization surveys do, it's sort of like, well, it's run really by the census that has the capacity to survey people. And so what they do is send out surveys and help complete surveys for a random sample of the American population and ask them if they have ever experienced violent crime or any other kind of crime. And so you're going to capture then people who didn't report, but they will say, yes, I have been a victim in a victimization survey. So these numbers are based on the federal victimization survey. Now, there are individual states that also do this. So there's sometimes states themselves that have their own local data that they do through a similar process. So that's where these numbers come from. They include both reported and unreported cases. So this comes directly from that report. And you can see right here that over 84% of Native women have reported in these surveys that they have experienced some form of violence. And then in the second line here, we see that over half of Native women who report that they have been victimized by some form of sexual violence. And so clearly this is, rivaling some of the highest rape rates in the United States and the world. We just don't see this kind of high rate of data in other contexts. So what I've set my career out to do is try to figure out the answer to why we have such high numbers of people being victimized. And when I first started learning about this issue in law school, as a Muskogee person, I wanted to understand why these data, say these such high rates of violence. Another data point that I think is really important, and this will make sense later in my presentation, but one of the really interesting things about American crime is that typically we talk about crime is typically, when we're talking about a person-on-person crime of some violent nature, usually that's an intra-racial experience. In other words, a white victim is statistically more likely to be victimized by another white person, and a Black person is more likely than not to be victimized by another Black person. And so that's sort of the status quo of the way violent crime unfolds. Now, the only exception to that general rule is when we're talking about Native people, okay? So more Native people experience interracial crime than any other group in the United States. So if we look at this, the top two bars, these are the numbers of Native people in, again, the victimization surveys. You're asked who committed the crime and any demographics you might have about that person who committed the crime. And so you see 97% of Native women report that they have been victimized by someone who is not Native, okay? And over 90% of male victims in Indian communities report that they have had a non-Native perpetrator, okay? So this is a really unusual sort of quirk in American criminology. This is typically not what you would see with other groups of people and other categories of people. Now, that's not to say that Native people don't victimize one another, right? They absolutely do. And excuse me, and we do have a challenge within communities of Native on Native crime. So, but that's captured in these second two bars here, where you see that they're around 35% of Native people report that they have been victimized by another Native person, okay? And you see that these numbers actually, you know, are over 100. So you've got 97% here for women and 35% here. Well, clearly that's more than 100%. What this means is that Native people tend to experience more than one incident of violence, maybe multiple instances of violence. And so what we have here is that some of the perpetrators are non-Native and some are Native, right? And this reflects the multiple experiences that any individual might have. Now hold on to this information, it will become really important later. The other thing that we often overlook in this work is the issues of LGBTQ plus Native people. And one of the umbrella terms that's used by some Native people who would maybe identify on a queer spectrum is Two-Spirit. And that was a label that was created in the, I think it was the mid 80s or early 90s, that serves as an umbrella term to describe all kinds of gender differences and sexuality differences. And the reason that Two-Spirit was created was really because a lot of Native people that fit into the LGBTQ continuum were really feeling excluded from the movement to, you know, to change the way in which queer people are portrayed or are experience the world around them. And so the Two-Spirit moniker is not necessarily specific to any particular tribe. It's really a personal choice that some people use because it sort of reflects the idea that some people have sort of a feminine and a masculine identity, and that may present as a somewhere on the spectrum of the umbrella term LGBTQ. There are some Native people that absolutely do not want to be called Two-Spirit. And so again, this is one of those kind of delicate issues that if you're in doubt, ask for the preference that that person uses. There are tribes that traditionally had 3 or 4 genders. There are tribes historically that somebody may do the work of women for part of their life and then the work of men in the latter half of their life, and vice versa. So there's a real fluidity in many traditional tribal cultures. And so Two-Spirit It tends to be the words, the phrase that we tend to fall to, but again, it's not all universal. Some people really don't like it. Kind of like the word queer. There's sort of a reclaiming of that word that was used as a, as a disparaging term, and sort of reclaiming that. But not everybody's comfortable with that reclaiming. So it's similar to that. The problem we have when we're trying to learn about two-spirit people and violence is that those national numbers I showed you earlier, they don't ask demographically what your gender identity or your sexual orientation is. So we just basically have men and women. And we don't know how many of the people that were surveyed would fall under this, this label. So what we have is some smaller studies. They're not national in scope, and they may include a very small sample size. But what we know is that the rates can be even higher for this population. Particularly two-spirit people have reported high rates of sexual violence at the rates of 85%, and physical assault as well. And over 84% of two-spirit people reported experiencing sort of hate crime type of victimization. So this is an area that's ripe for study. So if you're a student looking for a topic, or you are looking at grad school and possibly going into sociology or Indian studies or social work, this is an area that's really ripe for and really needed, because we don't have the kind of data to help us realize the extent of this problem. It's sort of an invisible problem as far as the feds are concerned, because they simply don't ask the question. So this is an area we do not know enough about. So I want to talk a little bit about pre-colonial principles of tribal nations. And this would, again, be the time prior to European arrival, okay? And most native cultures did not really have a systemic form of writing. So there was not really an alphabet for tribes. And so a lot of the tenets or the principles of tribal nations are things we've gleaned from looking at the historical record, in addition to communicating about these issues with tribal historians, both trained and non-trained. I don't know what that means, but both people who have letters after their name and those who don't. And there are over 570 federally recognized tribes in the United States. So what we need to understand is that each of those nations have their own independent history and their own independent sense of government and laws and safety. So, giving a presentation about all tribal nations, there's always going to have to be a disclaimer that what I have to say may not be at all relevant to other tribes. But in general, when we think about how pre-colonially the tribal nations govern things like violent crime, is first of all, tribal nations had full authority within their territories. So just, I'm sitting today in the state of Kansas, and the state of Kansas has the right to prosecute or respond to any crime within the boundaries of the state of Kansas. And so tribes had that as well. And the similar ideology that if you're government, you get to govern yourself, right? So that principle is certainly one that we think about quite a bit. In terms of crime, or in terms of dangerous behavior, what we find is that a lot of tribal nations used a much less punitive methodology, but rather a restitution-based ideology. And that means that we want to put victims back in the place where they are centered, and the community comes together to talk about the issue and determine the sanctions that would be imposed on a perpetrator. Some tribes had zero tolerance principles, especially for hurting children. Children in some, the translation to children or child in some tribal languages is actually sacred, or we would translate into English as sacred. So if you harmed a sacred being, you were harming sort of the heart and soul of the community, and you might be kicked out of the tribe even for one instance. Other tribes, but not all, were matrilocal and matrilineal. And so when we talk about that, what I mean is not a matriarchy. A lot of people sort of romanticize the idea of a tribal nation as a matriarchy. I'm not convinced yet that there were any tribal nations that where women completely ruled over men. We talk about patriarchy, and that's male control of government and resources, et cetera. But matriarchy is sort of the opposite of that. And I think our tribes tended to be more egalitarian, right, than matriarchal. But matrilineal refers to the lineal identity of a child. So if you are a child and you're born to a mother, you are part of the mother's family first and foremost, and then secondary, the father's lineage. So your primary, it's sort of the flip side of how surnames work in many parts of the United States, where you take your father's surname. And it was really very different within some tribal cultures where you would actually take your mother's surname or identity, and that would be the lineage then of that child. And matrilocal refers to a society in which when a heterosexual couple comes together, that typically the man is going to move into the woman's camp or family. And the reason that's important is because that really prevents isolation, right? Because the husband is living in and among his wife's brothers and uncles and father and so on. And there are some people who have posited that perhaps this explains, the idea that crime like domestic violence was fairly rare historically because of these matrilocal societies. And again, these are really big generalizations I'm making. So there are tribes that may again differ quite a bit from this slide and the description of these things. It's just got to smush 570 tribes into one, and it's challenging. So when I was in law school, one of the first classes that I took in my second year was federal Indian law. Now, I grew up in an urban area. Well, I guess as urban as Kansas is, Kansas can be. But I grew up in Wichita, Kansas, and I went to school where I'm back now teaching at the University of Kansas. And we were allowed to write a paper on basically any topic of our choice. And so one of the things, because I had been a rape crisis counselor for several years at that point, one of the things I really wanted to research is how the Muskogee Creek people had dealt with gendered violence prior to colonialism. And that's, again, a very difficult thing to research because there's not a written record of that history that we can necessarily read and understand. And so we have to rely sometimes on what non-native folks were saying about us. And that typically is problematic because there's a lot of racism in those old documents. There's a lot of Eurocentric views in that in the writings. So we have to be really thoughtful about what we rely on. But I like to turn to this work of William Bartram, who was an American naturalist living in the late 18th century. And he was an interesting fellow. He had a lot of kind of hobbies and brilliant ideas and things like that. Kind of, I guess you could kind of compare him to Thomas Jefferson, who was like inventing, things and writing the Declaration of Independence at the same time. And so he was sort of in that category. I don't think he owned slaves, however, but he decided to go down and live in what is now the southeastern part of the United States for about 10 years. And his goal in being down there was to categorize plants and animals. And he was a very gifted artist as well. And so he would draw the plants and draw the animals and just spend some time in the environment to learn about these various ideas and or these various plants and animal life. And he ended up kind of camping with or staying with Cherokee and Creek people who were also neighbors. So those tribes were neighbors. We shared a border with the Cherokee Nation. And so he spent quite a bit of time down there and with the goal, again, of documenting what kind of plants and animals live down there. But he also wrote a lot of journals and a lot of letters, and they have been compiled in several different kinds of tomes to capture, the observations that he made while he was living in this area. And one of the things he writes about, over and over and over again is the idea that he never saw gender violence in the 10 years that he lived in this part of the continent. And he remarks on this several times. This is just one example where he says, I never saw or heard of an instance of an Indian beating his wife or other female. And he often countered that in his writings with, that's not the way things are working in the sort of English colonies and the new United States. So he was drawing a sharp contrast between the way that he saw gender equity in the Southeast, where he didn't see it in, say, the Northeast, right? So this got me even more interested in exploring this further. And so the next piece of my research was to find Creek laws. Again, very difficult to do if we don't have an alphabet of sorts to communicate in writing. But in the early 1800s, we were under a lot of pressure to assimilate. And if we would assimilate to the extent that the Indian agent who was in charge of us was satisfied, then we would get the label civilized. So most of the time in early white history, there's the word savages, which is actually in the Declaration of Independence, called savages or heathens or other forms of pejorative terms. But if we wanted to be civilized, we needed to do that so we would not be vulnerable to, to bad actions on the part of the United States. Now, again, we did not have an alphabet. So we developed the alphabet sort of after removal, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So after we got to Indian Territory, which is today the state of Oklahoma, we didn't have a written alphabet. So what this represents is a law that was passed orally by the tribal leadership and then translated into English for the purposes of satisfying the requirement we had been given by our Indian agent. And most of these laws, so they're written in kind of broken English because, right, trying to translate words into English was challenging at the time. Still challenging. I'm trying to learn the language, and believe me, it's challenging. So these were oral laws that were written down to try to satisfy the request or the demand made by the white folks that were overseeing us. Now, most of the laws, there's 55 or 56 of these laws that were initially written, and largely they mirrored laws that the state governments would have had at the same time, just to sort of like cover our bases. Okay, we have a murder law, we have a divorce law, we have a juvenile justice law, etc. And most of them just mirrored the kinds of the laws that we would have had at the state level. But here's the one that really sticks out to me, because this kind of language certainly didn't exist in early America in the early 19th century. So what you see here is there's definitely I think a reference to rape in terms of undertaking to force a woman, and did it by force. It shall be left to the woman what punishment she should be satisfied with. What she say, it be law. And I highlight that last in red because I think it's such a powerful statement reflecting not what the states were doing at that time, but how the Muskogee Creek people thought about this crime of sexual violence. And, it's clearly a gendered law in terms of, only men could be, well, it says that any person or persons, but women are the only victims anticipated by this law. And so it is, something that we can't really say is egalitarian, but what she say, be it law, it be law, is a really powerful way to think about what would happen if we had a criminal justice system where a woman's or a victim's voice determined the outcome of the case. I'm not necessarily saying we need to bring this back to life. I'm providing this information because I think it's really important to contrast the way in which many tribal nations responded to these kinds of crimes and the way the Anglo-American legal system responded to these crimes. And you would not find any kind of American law in 1824 that put the woman sort of at the center of the question about whether a crime had been committed and what should happen. So this was really interesting to me, and I began to learn more and more about Muskogee law and Creek law, and it took me to this question that, you know, if we had these low rates of violence in traditional settings, and now we have the highest rate in the planet, by some estimates, how did that happen? You know, why did we go from low rates of violence to high rates of violence? And that's sort of been the question that's guided my career in terms of figuring out how to fix the problem. Because for me, you can't fix a problem without knowing its origins, right? So if you're going to fix a contemporary problem, you kind of have to go back in time to figure out when the problem started and how it manifests. And so that's the kind of work that I've been doing to try to figure out if we can understand what's happened here and what this journey looks like, then we can begin to, you know, create solutions that respond to these problems, right? So that's my life question. And I want to talk about the word sovereignty. I mentioned it a little bit earlier, and it's the title of the talk. And sovereignty sounds like I don't know, to some people, like kind of a highfalutin word, or a 50-cent word, as we say. But tribal nations have had sovereignty, which means that they have the power to govern themselves, right? So it's sort of inherent with any government. The point of being a government is to govern oneself, govern the people. And so, you know, we often take it for granted when we're talking about states or even the federal government. You know, the state of Kansas, where I sit today, has sovereignty. So we have laws that were created by a legislature, and then those are enforced. It's not very complicated, right? But when we start talking about it in the context of tribal nations, it becomes much more, you know, sort of fraught, right? The idea that tribal nations have the power to address and respond to their own affairs is something that we take for granted in other contexts, but tribal nations are continuously in this battle to be able to govern ourselves, and our governments are created by our own people for our own people. So I'll come back to that in a little bit. But, you know, as somebody who works with survivors of sexual assault, I see a very similar problem that develops, right? The ideal is that, you know, as a human being, you have the right to make the decisions about what happens to you and your body and your relationships, right? That's the way it should be, that we make those decisions for our own sense of self and well-being. But when somebody is assaulted, that's an intrusion on that sovereign right, right? So somebody chooses to touch someone or harass somebody or, you know, sexually assault somebody. That's a form of violation of that individual person's sovereignty. And so I draw a parallel between what's happened to tribal nations, but also what's happened to individual people. And this is the sort of, I think these explain, if you look at them together, explain what has happened to lead to such high rates of violence. So if we think about tribal nations that had legal systems, you know, that worked well or kept violence in bay, what's happened is that those systems particularly have been weakened, or in some cases completely dissolved by settler colonial power and control. Okay, so they've intruded on tribal sovereignty, just as a perpetrator intrudes on someone's body, right? And so that's why I think that in order to end rape as we know it, as a political, you know, crime, is that we have to think about how the sovereignty of tribal nations is directly connected to sovereignty of individual survivors. Okay. So I want to start by saying a few things about Columbus, right? Because one of the big forms of activism that's really, really coming, a very common concern is Columbus Day, right? So that was a federal holiday forever. And many Native people and their allies have come forward and said, Columbus was actually a really bad dude, so let's stop honoring him, and let's stop, because it's sort of a representation of the harm that the European invasion sort of caused, right? And so I think there's some degree of understanding of that story, that Columbus was not, the hero that so many people have thought over the years. And so a lot of states and universities and the like are changing the name and naming it Indigenous Peoples Day, and sort of like reclaiming the day for Native people. But I think it's really important because Christopher Columbus has been often like sort of framed as a historical icon, right? That he's the image, or the sort of not metaphor, but the sort of like the symbol of genocide and the symbol of European invasion. But in fact, they were also literally raping people, right, at the same time. So it's not just a matter of the symbolism. There's actually written accounts of white men raping Native women when they arrived at what we know as North America. And they were not feeling too guilty about it too. This is a particular man who went with Columbus on the second trip in 1495. And he wrote in his journal that he decided to tie a Native woman up and rape her and meet her, right? Entitlement, he's not trying to hide this if he's writing it in his journal. There are other examples of this. And so it's not just that Columbus represents a symbol of genocide, it's also literally, sort of intertwined with the idea that Native women are property and that white men have access to them without any restriction. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind when we think about the founding of the United States and the founding of the colonies, to talk about the literal harm that was done and not just the symbolic harm that was done. I want to talk about two kinds of sort of federal issues. And again, it's a little legal for, because that's how I'm trained as a lawyer. So I think of federal policy and federal laws, right? That impact the way in which Native people have come to expect that sexual assault is sort of a given in life, right? You're more likely to be raped than not. And I want to tell a story of the public policy that sort of brought this crisis into our nation's history. So I like to look at the example of removal, which was a policy that the United States had for certain tribes at certain times, right? So most people have probably heard at some point about the Trail of Tears, right? Even those of us who haven't gotten the education we wish we would have had about these issues, the Trail of Tears is sort of something you've probably heard of, or something that more about, especially if you're a citizen of one of these tribes. But the problem was in the 1830s that rich American oligarchs and the like really wanted this land, right, in the Southeast, because this was good farmland. It was good for plantations, for example. And so they wanted all of these Native people out of this area, especially here in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. And then down here, we also have the Seminole in Florida. So you can see that it's not a trail of tears, it's many, many trails and many, many tears, and worse than tears, okay? So, you lose your homeland, you're forced to march on foot to this new territory in Indian Territory, and this later became Oklahoma in 1907. But we were promised that once we got there, we could stay there forever, and that we would never, ever be, like, our sovereignty would never be sort of under attack anymore if we just got out of the way. But many, many people died on this trail, these many trails, especially the elders and the young babies, from exposure, from disease. and they just had to be buried, at the side of the trail, and move on. And so the other thing that's happening in this time is that there is widespread sexual violence that also accompanies this trail, because many of these movements were initiated and created by the military, by the United States military. So they were in charge of sort of executing this removal time. And so these soldiers would sometimes at nighttime take a woman or a girl, away from camp and sexually assault her and then return her to the camp in the morning. And this is documented in sort of hundreds of journals, largely by missionaries, which is really interesting because there were a lot of very sympathetic missionaries that accompanied Native people and kept careful notes about what was going on. So by the time you get to Indian Territory, and this is affecting 5 different tribes in this area, that things are not well. There's a lot of what we call trauma. We know what trauma is today. It's a psychological phenomenon in which people are recalling a very difficult event or have experienced some form of crisis that's still affecting them, right? So that's how I would describe, sort of what happens in removal periods. And again, this removal was actually contrary to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court issued an opinion saying that these tribes were nations and they can't just be moved off the land. And Andrew Jackson, who was the president, said, fine, the Supreme Court says what they're going to say, then, let them try to enforce it because I'm moving these people. And that's what happened. And so the important thing to remember is that the trail, or the Trails of Tears, is not the only geographical removal that happened. Many, many nations across the continent were moved, right? Moved from point A to point B because somebody wanted point A. And so this is the classification of removals. But removals were not limited, again, to a particular region. This is a picture taken in the mid-19th century of some Dene women, also known as Navajo women. This picture was taken when these women and girls were captive by the military. We don't know much about the picture. We know it was taken in the 1860s. We know that it was taken of women who are essentially military prisoners at this time, and they had also undergone a very long journey, which they call the Long Walk. And so for me, as somebody who's worked with a lot of survivors over the years, I really am triggered by this picture. I think it conveys that there's something more than hunger and fatigue going on. I see trauma in the faces and the eyes in this picture. I can't prove that these women had been sexually assaulted, but given what we know about the removal periods, it would be very possible that these women and girls had experienced some form of sexual violence as well. Again, I'm conjecturing here, I'll admit that, but it's just something else I like to show, to humanize this time period, because we don't have a lot of images that reflect this problem. So another policy that people are usually familiar with is the loss of land that Native people experienced through treaties, through swindling, through broken treaties and the like, is that Native people have lost most of the land that was occupied by Native people. So this bottom piece here in 1977, the lowest, where you see what's sort of left. And it's not entirely accurate. There's still reservations that are in the southeast and northeast. But this generally gives you an idea how drastic this land removal was. And that the reason this is important from the context of sexual violence has to do, again, with the neurobiology of trauma. So in a lot of tribal cultures, they're very much tied, the spirituality that's expressed by the people is very much tied to some aspect of the land, right? So many tribal cultures, right, would pray in a certain place. and oftentimes to engage with particularly like a mountain or a cliff or a butte or a river or some form of landmark or geographical occurrence that would be the place to go if you had been experiencing some form of trauma. And that was where your ancestors had been praying for 10,000 years, right? And so it's a very, very sacred place where people seek solace. And so what's happened is obviously the loss of land is devastating for political reasons and for economic reasons, but it also matters to survivors of sexual violence, because if you're engaging with spiritual beliefs, you may no longer have access to that area, right? Because it's now been overrun by people who want to have the land for themselves. And so a lot of these spaces and these spiritual spaces are no longer available to people who've been through some form of trauma. And sometimes people have to break the law, like in a national park or a state park, to get access to where a prayer is appropriate. Unlike many Christian denominations where you can build a church, right? And then that becomes the location of prayer and worship. Tribal communities tend to rely on landmarks that obviously you can't move a cliff from place to place. So that's been very challenging, and a lot of people don't really consider that aspect of it when looking at the history of sexual assault. Another federal policy that's very important for people to understand is the boarding school era. And this is a time period that a lot of people are not familiar with. But essentially what had happened in the late 19th century, so in the late 1880s, late 1800s, is that it had become too expensive to kill Indians, frankly. There was a policy of extermination. And in fact, the Indian Affairs Department was in the Department of War. So what is now the Department of Defense, but at the time it was the War Department, and that is where Native people would be adjudicated or governed from that perspective as a sort of enemy combatant, if you will. And there were actually debates on the floor of Congress talking about, it's very, very expensive and it's spending, a lot of money to kill Indians. So we got to think of another option. And so the option that they sort of developed as a federal policy is one of brainwashing. Okay, so you take a Native child away from their community and teach them everything, from English to the Western ways, essentially, right? And so you then punish the children for doing anything that's sort of related to Native issues. And you're punished for that. You're punished for speaking the language you grew up with. And so this brainwashing policy is sort of sanitized. It's called the boarding school era. And many of the boarding schools were run by churches, but others were run by the government. And in fact, it's kind of interesting because at some point the government sort of chopped up the United States into different regions, and they would like give different denominations. You're in charge of this region, and so most of the people have even today are still members of like Presbyterian Church, or there's a very interesting sort of regional difference. But at any rate, the brainwashing policy was actually articulated as kill the Indian and save the man. So take everything indigenous out of this child and replace it with the rules and the regulations that the federal government thought they needed. And so many of these children were taken without parental consent. Some of them just disappeared in the night because they were taken off and put in boarding schools. So I like to show some before and after pictures of this time period, because the goal was really to take these children and transform them into something that they were not. So this is and what would happen is a lot of these boarding schools would create, would hold fundraisers and show sort of before and after pictures of how they had transformed these sort of, I guess, sort of savages into civilized people. And so they would show these pictures to try to raise money for the continuation or expansion of the school. So they were very proud of the transformation that they had forced on these children. So here's a group of Apache children. So they would have been in Arizona, or what was to become Arizona. And you can see here that it was photographed by the US Army, because in many cases, the military was asked to round up children to take them to these boarding schools. So this is the same group of children just a few months later. Okay, so you can see here that a lot has changed. Haircuts, military uniforms, there's just a lot of everything. So again, the exact same children, not necessarily in the same positions, but the exact same children here. Now, these children were taken from Apache land all the way to Pennsylvania. So they wanted to move them as far as possible from the Indian people, that their parents and their Indian community. So put them on a train or a truck or whatever, I guess trucks weren't invented, but at any rate, took these children away from their parents. And the boarding school era actually really didn't end until the late 1960s. So it was an 80-year sort of policy of the United States. And in some cases, 30 to 40% of the children in any given community were subject to this. So they were forced, their parents were forced to send their children to boarding school, and they were punished for speaking their language or praying or doing anything that they were familiar with. Physical, corporal punishment was very common, which is not a technique of discipline used in many tribal cultures. You don't hit a child. And essentially, we're not allowed to go home. You know, if there's a funeral or a ceremony that the child wanted to attend, they were not allowed to leave. So they were essentially little prison camps. And the reason I bring this up is because anytime you have that kind of power imbalance, right, where you have these sort of vulnerable young children who don't understand what's happening, and you have, powerful non-native people who are making decisions, sexual abuse is, sort of a side effect of that, right? And so in many of boarding schools, there was a lot of corporal punishment, but there was also a lot of sexual abuse going on. Now, this didn't happen in every boarding school, and there are some people, especially 20th century people who had a good time at the boarding school they attended. So there's not necessarily one experience, but some boarding schools were very, very helpful and useful by teaching reading and writing and those kinds of things. But sexual abuse did occur in these entities, and the reason we know that is because there's letters and journals that speak to it, but the 20th century survivors of boarding school have remarked and come forward and talked about the number of people they know who were sexually assaulted in these boarding schools. Okay. So that's another policy that imposed, more trauma on the nations. Now, when I get to this point, people are usually feeling a little dejected because, especially if you didn't know this information, you're like, oh my God, these poor Indians. Well, in fact, there were many Native people who were speaking out about the problem. And so it wasn't as though it was a passive victim population. Native people did stand up for themselves, and Native people did call out the behavior that was so problematic. And one of the people that I look to is a woman named Sarah Winnemucca, who was a Paiute woman, and she was the first Native woman to publish a book in the United States. And the book is called Life Among the Paiutes, because that's her people. It was basically a diatribe of all the harms that had happened to her people. And she's very intelligent, well-educated, spoke 5 languages, and really did a number of tours through New England and giving speeches to sympathetic white audiences and telling them exactly what happened to her and her sisters, right? And so this book, Life Among the Paiutes, is not centered specifically on sexual violence, but it does talk about sexual violence as part of the harm that her people had experienced. She recalls, for instance, in one point when the soldiers, the first white man she ever saw was a soldier, a United States soldier, and her mother like half buried her in the dirt, like not enough for her not to be able to breathe, but kind of put her in a little sort of trench of some sorts and pushed dirt over her because they were worried about what would happen. So the main thing, the reason I bring this up is to give a little pause and look at some, some heroes of the time period, but also just to let you know that, in this time period, she wrote the book in 1883, and the reason that I think that's really notable is because, it was even dangerous and really unacceptable for white women to talk about rape in this time period. Any discussion of sexuality or anything along those lines was really not easy to find an audience for. And in fact, women would be, likely punished for some of that. But here's a Native woman who's writing a book, and she's telling the truth, and she's telling the truth specifically about sexual violence. And so I find that very compelling, that she was not passive in her efforts. But she did a lecture circuit. She often even used the moniker of a princess because although there was no royalty in the tribe, that got more people to her lectures. So she played the role. She put on her costume and said she was Princess Sarah, and that got people to her lecture, which is exactly what she wanted. And she was able to raise a lot of money that then she used to develop a school that would be on the reservation back in the Great Basin area, a Native run school. And so that was what she was trying to fundraise for, so that she could start a school for Paiute children. Okay, so now I'm going to take a little bit of a shift. We talked about federal policy. Now I want to talk about federal law. And I'll try to make it as least boring as possible, because this topic takes over a semester in law school. But I want to talk about 2 laws and 1 Supreme Court case. Okay, so the first law that we're going to talk about is the Major Crimes Act. And the Major Crimes Act was passed in 1885, so kind of along the same lines as the boarding schools started to appear. And the Major Crimes Act is still good law today. And so what it does is it allows it doesn't mandate, but it allows the federal government power over crime that happens on an Indian reservation. So I want to tell you a little bit of the backdrop of why this law was passed. This is a picture of 2 Brule Lakota chiefs that were in the Dakota territories in the late 19th century. And on the left, you have a man known as Crow Dog, and on the right, you have a man named Spotted Tail. And while they were leaders of the same group of people and had different sort of government duties, they were not a fan of one another, I think is an understatement. They had longstanding feuds about policy and protocol and what to do about the inclusion of more white settlers. One might characterize Crow Dog as a little less accommodating to white people, and Spotted Tail maybe a little bit more prone to be more, offer more concessions, I suppose. So Crow Dog shot and killed Spotted Tail, probably with the gun that you see him with there on the left. And so there was really no question about who had done it. But what the Lakota people decided to do is, of course, sort of prosecute that crime, not in the sense that we would think about prosecution today, right? Because we didn't have robes and gavels and all those kinds of attributes of what we think of as judicial in the American setting. But rather it was a victim-centered resolution. So he was adjudicated, found guilty, again, not in the same way we would think about it today, but he was also sanctioned for this. And he was given the community itself said, okay, so now we have Crow Dog, we have Spotted Tail, which Spotted Tail had a large family, right? A large extended family. And so Crow Dog's sanction was to provide all of the material goods that Spotted Tail's family needed as a result of his homicide or his being a victim of homicide. And so Crow Dog was now then responsible for food, shelter, any material goods that were needed by Spotted Tail's family. And that was resolved as far as that community was concerned. They had a finding of guilty, they had a sentence, and that was the end of the discussion, right? Well, the federal agents that lived in this area were horrified by that outcome, because for them, they saw it as a slap on the wrist, right? Not really understanding what the extent to which that compensation and restitution allowed. They were outraged. And Crow Dog, again, was not what we would sort of characterize as a good Indian. He was a renegade bad Indian. And so the federal government decided to prosecute him so he would be given a real sentence. So they charged him in federal court with a homicide, essentially. And he was found guilty and he was sentenced to the death penalty. Okay. Well, Crow Dog and his attorney took the case all the way to the US Supreme Court. And their argument was, okay, per the treaty, this is our land, right? It's bounded. We know like where the boundaries or the end of the extent of jurisdiction is. And this crime happened completely within our authority. And there's no really any reason why the federal government would have the power to come in and adjudicate a crime that's not part of their land, right? So example would be if France decided to come into Kansas and arrest somebody for a crime and then charge them in French court, right? It just, it doesn't make any sense. Like boundaries are boundaries. And believe it or not, Crow Dog actually won this case, okay? Which is fascinating to people who hear this story for the first time. Is the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Crow Dog. I mean, come on. And he was set free. And so this even further agitated white settlers and federal agents who now saw him again as walking free. The Supreme Court had said there's no law that allows federal jurisdiction here, but maybe Congress could write a law and give themselves that power. And that's exactly what they did. So what happened is, sorry, I have dogs that are making noise right now. So this Major Crimes Act was an act of Congress, both the Senate, the House, and it's signed by the President, a response to the ex parte Crow Dog case. And so what Congress said is, okay, well, the Supreme Court said we don't have any authority on Indian reservations. And so let's change that and say we do. And it really was quite that simple. It was completely unilateral. No tribes were consulted. No tribes consented to this. But what it said is, okay, we didn't have authority before, but now we do because we passed a law that says we do have authority on reservations. And it's still good law today on most reservations in the lower 48. If there is a crime like child sex abuse, sexual assault, severe domestic violence, etc., the federal government has the authority to come in to that community and execute justice, and adjudicate as well as sentence. And again, no tribes asked for this. It was in violation of numerous treaties that promised that the tribe would be left alone to do its own thing. Nonetheless, it is passed and still good law today. So on today's Indian reservations, you often have not the state involved in any way, but the FBI and the US attorneys are responding to things like sexual abuse in Indian country. So that's, the thing is, it really, there's no mandate, right? So the federal prosecutors have this power, but they don't have to use it because they have discretion over the types of cases that they hear. And so they were often, they oftentimes didn't prosecute these cases, but it is still the law today in many, many places. Now, I want to go quickly through the Indian Civil Rights Act, which is a law passed by Congress in 1968. It did a number of different things regarding the Bill of Rights and the constitutional individual rights people in court. But the reason I raise it is because it also limited the ability of a tribal court to impose a carceral sentence of over 1 year. So that was the limitation, is it doesn't matter. The tribe can still prosecute in its own courts, but the maximum penalty that a tribal judge can impose is 1 year. Okay. And so when we think about crimes like sexual violence and sexual assault, and the kind of sentences that a state can impose, you know, the average sentence, I think, for a rape in United States state courts is somewhere between 7 and 15 years. That's kind of fits into that category. Somebody's convicted of like the most serious form of rape. But 1 year, you know, doesn't, if you think about a carceral system, and that's a system that you want to rely on, 1 year does not seem sufficient to deal with some of these very heinous types of crimes. And yet that's what tribal governments are limited to. And then we have this case called Oliphant versus Suquamish. This was a Supreme Court case in 1978, not 1878, 1978. And this involved a couple of white men who lived on the Suquamish Reservation, which is up in Washington State. And these were two guys who, they lived on the reservation. They weren't even visiting, they lived there. And they got charged with drunk and disorderly. They you know, kind of were causing some issues one night. And so the tribe prosecuted them, and they protested that it wasn't fair to be prosecuted by the tribe since they weren't members of the tribe, right? They weren't enrolled members of the tribe, and they couldn't be because they were white. And those guys took it all the way to Supreme Court, and they won. So, and unfortunately, when the Supreme Court makes a decision about one tribe, it applies to all tribes. And so they found that the Suquamish Nation did not have the criminal authority to prosecute Oliphant and Belgrade, who were the two defendants, because the tribe was dependent on the United States. They sort of created this whole legal doctrine in this case and said from here on out, tribes can't prosecute any non-Indians. Now, this is the piece where I want to harken back to the early statistics that I shared with you about the high rate of interracial crime experienced by Native people, right? So, and one of the reasons, there's a lot of factors we might consider into that dynamic, but one of the reasons is because tribes can't prosecute non-Indians, right? Pursuant to this Supreme Court case. So it may be, particularly among very savvy predators, right? Or some cartels, for example, will set up shop in Indian country because it's, you know, while the federal government could come in and prosecute it, it's easier to get away with crimes if you commit them in Indian country. And so this may be, I think, one explanation of the high rate of interracial crime experienced by both Native women and men. So by the end of the 20th century, our sovereignty was nearly stripped from us. We could only prosecute Native people. We had 1 year limitation on any crime, including murder. We are poor, by and large. Native people come from very poor reservations. So jail space, bailiffs, metal detectors, judges, etc. is very, very expensive to run a criminal justice system. And the other thing to keep in mind is that tribes still retain certain like fundamental nuggets of sovereignty. So tribes can create alternative approaches to crime, which would include non-carceral approaches. And in fact, I don't think there's an archaeologist who wrote a few years back that there's no evidence whatsoever of a prison or a jail prior to contact, prior to arrival of Europeans. And so that wasn't the way we dealt with crime. Now, we did have the death penalty, which I don't, want to bring back. We did have corporal punishment in some tribes, including my own. So, while there are certainly harsh punishments that were meted out, there was not a concept of a jail or a prison. And so I think that really is inspiring for those of us who are really critical about the over-policing of Black and brown bodies, as well as the over-incarceration of people of color. So here's the good news. I'm almost done. Good news. In 2010, Obama signed the Tribal Law and Order Act, which is a legislation that I worked on. And it has it was a really thick piece of legislation. It had a lot of moving parts. But the one thing that I want to say about that is that it did raise the sentencing limitation for tribes from 1 year to 3. So now the maximum is 3 years, which still, if you compare that to the state power, doesn't really seem, that big of an increase, but it made a difference. Victims coming forward, if they know their perpetrator is going to come out in a year versus 3 years, that may be provide them with more comfort as to coming forward. And then in March of 2013, Obama signed the Violence Against Women Act, which was a reauthorization. It was originally passed in 1994. And so in this law, we took the Oliphant decision, and we didn't get rid of it completely, but we were able to get Congress to give us a jurisdiction over non-Indians for certain specific reasons. So domestic violence committed by a non-Indian, dating violence committed by a non-Indian, and violation of protection orders committed by a non-Indian on an Indian reservation, the tribe can once again prosecute those crimes, despite Oliphant. So there is a bill pending right now, the new Violence Against Women Act of 2021, and we are going back and asking for additional expansion of our inherent authority to include sexual assault, sexual abuse, and assault on a police officer, so that we can prosecute non-Indians who commit those kinds of crimes on the reservation. And again, this is not a mandate. Tribes have these options. If the options don't sit right with their culture or their traditions, they don't have to do these things, right? But they're just giving more options to tribal nations. The other thing we've been doing is working in the Supreme Court and trying to address victims' issues within Indian country. This is the interesting, it's a Dollar General case, but the case involved a child victim. I think he was 12 or 13, and he was molested by a white man when he was working, well, it wasn't really working, but there was a Job Corps program for youth on the Choctaw Reservation down in Mississippi, and local retail establishments signed in with the tribe to say, hey, let's get these kids off the street for the summer and show them what like working at retail is like, or working at a restaurant is like, or working at a casino is like, and allow them to sort of get a sense of sort of careers that they might pursue. And so one of the companies that agreed to do this was Dollar General, and Dollar General had their store on the reservation, had a business lease with the tribe, and paid taxes to the tribe to have that retail establishment on the reservation. And so this young boy was molested by a white man, and of course, so the tribe can't prosecute him for that. And the perpetrator was banished, fired and banished from the tribe, no longer has access to people on the tribal nation, but was never prosecuted because the tribe couldn't prosecute. And then the feds that could have prosecuted didn't think it was a serious enough crime because there was no penetration. And so what they decided to do is that we need justice for our boy. Let's go file a civil lawsuit in tribal court, right? Let's go sue them for counseling bills and medical bills and all of the other, sort of pain and suffering, right? To get Dollar General to be held accountable in some way for the harm. And so what we did is we filed an amicus brief. And the amicus brief that I worked with, it's not the main brief of the case, but it's sort of called the friend of a court. Like other people who have a vested stake in the outcome of the decision can also file briefs. So the Supreme Court knows like sort of the aftermath of what might happen. And so we wrote this brief on behalf of Native women's organizations as well as non-Native organizations that supported this effort. And so that's the front page of the brief. And we also told stories in our brief, which is not a very usual thing to do, but we told stories in the brief about women and children who had been victimized in this way. So we also went to the Supreme Court and listened to the arguments, and had activism going on outside to make a presence known that that this kind of crime needed some kind of remedy, right? So I was inside listening to the arguments, and this activism was happening outside in 2015. It was a tie vote. There were only 8 justices at the time. Justice Scalia had passed away, and so they were left with 8 judges, and they couldn't decide. So we were 1 vote away from an Oliphant kind of decision for civil matters. So what that means is that the Fifth Circuit, which is where this crime occurred, that the tribe had won at the lower level. And so finally, the case can now proceed in tribal court. And this took so long that that child is now in his 30s. So it takes a really long time to get those cases through the system. So we decided to file briefs in other cases too, to make sure that the Supreme Court had access to information that would tell them that this is going to have a disparate impact on victims on Indian reservations. So there are a few others that we filed. Now, we don't know if they really read the briefs because they don't have to, but we have, the side that we have fought for in these other cases have all been victories for the tribal interests. And we have a case that's pending right now called Cooley that we've filed a brief in. Almost done. So one of the things that a lot of people talk about, is how do you do this work, and isn't it, depressing and stressful to work with sexual assault issues? And absolutely it is. And so if you work in this area, you know about vicarious trauma, you know about secondary trauma, and sort of what it's like to work on this issue all the time. And so I read a lot of poetry. I'm not really a fiction reader so much, but I read a lot of poetry. And this poem was a stanza from the Fear poem written by Joy Harjo, who is also a member of my tribe. And she has this long poem called the Fear poem, and it's a poem to get rid of fear. And so this is a stanza from one of her fears, one of her poems that really resonates with me. So you got to find those ways that you can do, as we call, self-care. So that's all I have for you. Thank you very much for having me. And I hope that we can have a good discussion at this point with questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So for everyone else here who's on the call, feel free to put questions in the chat, and then we will get to those as we see them. We will either allow you to unmute yourselves, or if you want us to ask on your behalf, we can do that as well. So while some of those questions are coming in, I have one that I think might be, is relevant. So in terms of the colonization, I'm trying to wrap my head around the colonization from the, of and Native folks, as well as other marginalized groups as well.
Okay.
And it seemed that the Europeans used tactics of guns and just massive amounts of people to, control, persuade, move people from one place to another, and to get folks to do what they wanted them to do. Is it more to it than that, or were those kind of the two or three kind of main elements, like the violence and the fear, as well as a mass number of people?
Yeah, I think you've got it right on the head. And there are, whole articles of scholars sort of analyzing what colonization really means and sort of breaking it down in different ways. I'm hearing more and more academics using the term settler colonialism as a more precise term or phrase, I suppose, because a lot of what colonial governments are is that, they set the mother country or the great white father or whoever, sets up colonies there, but never expects them to be permanent. Historically, they were just going to take some gold and go back home. But with the United States and they didn't go. I mean, people are still here, and so settler colonialism is a present tense term as well. People talk about, we still live in a settler colonial society because Native people are so marginalized. Colonization is not over, right? So I think, yeah, I think that's exactly how I would describe it as well. I have my Diet Coke. There are no dumb questions, by the way. So if you feel nervous about the question you have, please don't be, because this is curriculum that doesn't often make its way to many public schools, K through 12 schools. So this might be brand new to some people, or you may be more of an expert than I am. So comments are fine.
Yes, yes, go ahead and you can unmute yourself, Paul, and make a comment.
Yeah, I want to thank you for your presentation. I found it very moving, very upsetting. Even though I've heard some of these things before, it's just, I feel ashamed to be a white person sometimes. I wanted to say also that I saw a movie several years ago called Rabbit Proof Fence, which takes place in Australia, and
Yes.
It was the British colonialists who removed children, Native children, Aboriginal children, from their parents. It's a very beautiful movie, and it just came to me as I was watching your presentation. So I just wanted to share that with the group.
Yeah, I absolutely recommend that movie. It takes place in Australia, but it's almost exactly what happened here on this continent. And one other thing that's sort of connected to that I think is really interesting is that about 20, maybe 15, 20 years ago, the United Nations passed the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it was a nearly unanimous vote in favor. There were 4 countries that did not support it: the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So now since then, I think the United States anyway has acquiesced and says, well, we like it, but we don't like it as much as other people do. But yeah, there were very similar strategies, and the same before and after pictures that I talked about is a very pivotal scene in this movie called Rabbit Proof Fence, because he uses the old slide projectors to show these on the wall about, okay, if we can get these Aboriginal girls to marry white men, and then their children marry white men, we can actually exterminate through that policy of sort of breeding. It's very disturbing, but it is very similar to what we saw in the United States.
And the only other thing I want to say is sometimes I understand anti-vigilism. I'm grateful that you haven't taken that path, Sarah, and that you work through the law, and thank you for your work.
Thank you.
I just wanted to comment that I was very taken by the parallel of the sovereignty of tribal nations and the sovereignty of individuals. And when you showed the maps of the territories and the ways in which the territories themselves seem to have been raped by colonists, and yeah, I mean, so much of it was very sad and distressing, and the way you highlighted again the Trail of Tears, the way in which our education is so sterilized, like we get just such a teeny piece of all that really occurred. So I thank you very much as well for the work that you're doing, and I'm glad to know that you're taking care, because it sounds like very, very difficult work.
Well, fortunately, I work with a lot of Native women and men on these issues. I'm not doing this by myself in any way, shape, or form. And, you know, I'm a scholar, but I'm actually learned more from people without high school diplomas than I have in the classroom at times, because living this day to day, I didn't experience living as a Native person today. First of all, I have white privilege. Second of all, my father was a judge and I was growing up in a very well-to-do middle class neighborhood. And so I didn't experience growing up with the kind of sort of historical trauma that other people did, but I was a citizen of a tribe, right? So that's why when I got to law school, I decided to really revisit that ancestry from the tribe that I'm enrolled in, and that sort of set me on the path. Yeah.
I wanted a further comment. I was really amazed by that one law where women were empowered to create the punishment. Just that sense of empowerment of women, which is, you know, a rarity.
Right.
And yeah, I wonder if there's any evidence of how that panned out, and whether there were opportunities for women to mete out punishment, and what that would have looked like.
Yeah.
I was fascinated by that.
Yeah, it is very fascinating. And the other part of that is sort of the punishments that were available to her per the law were corporal punishment or payment. And obviously the corporal punishment is, you know, it's not something that I think we should revive. It's just like the death penalty. I don't want the government to do violence on people of any kind. But again, it was translated roughly from what the Creek leaders had decided. And so the corporal punishment and then the payment didn't necessarily mean like a monetary settlement. It might have been something like what a Crow Dog had to provide to Spotted Tail, which is provide all the needs of that victim, material goods, food, shelter, ceremonial items, and the like, could have been the payment, right, for the harm that was done, and the victim being able to make that call. The only thing we have in America that's somewhat similar is victim impact statements. But they're just that, they're statements. They don't have any real legal power. I mean, the judge can listen, and it's sometimes a form of healing to be able to speak to the court about the harm that you've experienced, either as a victim or, you know, a family member, perhaps of a murder victim, to be able to speak. But we didn't have that in the United States until just, you know, a few decades ago, and it doesn't always even exist in particular communities. And it certainly doesn't affect the sentence and the final decision that's made by the judge and or the jury. But yeah, I think the idea of creating a system where victims have more power is very intriguing to me. At the same time, though, we also have to confront the carceral state and how we can empower victims without necessarily locking people up for long periods of time. But yeah, no, I love that law. It changed my life. That started my path. I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. Because that's the time I was working as a rape crisis counselor.
So there's a question that came into the chat from Janine, and it reads, what do you think would be the best way to get this knowledge out there to people? Maybe start in the schools?
Yes. Let's see, I'm looking for that. Yes, starting in schools, is that right? Is that the question I'm answering?
Yes, sorry,
okay,
that's the question.
Sorry,
yep.
I was trying to make sure I saw the right one. Yes, absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, most Americans can't even name a Native woman in history. And if they do, it's Pocahontas or it's Sacagawea. And that's it. You know, you saw the kids love that Pocahontas film. And it's so romanticized and so inaccurate historically. and then the Sacagawea. So the two Native people that most average Americans can name are not even in the 20th century, right? So it's this idea that Natives were there and then they're not now. And, you know, only about 12 or 15% of children's nonfiction books about Native Americans discuss the 20th century at all. So it's very much children are being raised in a culture where, oh yeah, they were Indians, how interesting, and we can talk about the Pilgrims, but that's sort of where the knowledge ends. But there are states that require K through 12 curriculum. I can't name them off the top of my head. It's not in Oklahoma, that's for sure. But I think Montana and perhaps Wisconsin mandate some exposure to tribal issues in the K through 12 curriculum. Like I said, don't quote me on that, but I think it's a great idea. And I think that, you know, the more we can do that and have people understand the story and not wait until they're in their 20s or 30s and are like horrified and guilty that they didn't know this, is really critical, because I think that people feel more confident when they understand this history about being allies and about being supportive. So yes, I think more education is definitely needed.
Great, thank you so much. While we wait for any other further questions, I wanted to ask, is there something, I'm sorry, I'm sure there's something, but what would you say would be, you know, like a handful of like nuggets, we'll call them, for our sexual violence counselors on the line, or advocates, or volunteers? What should they take away in terms of working with Native populations that they might be able to apply to their work, kind of generally or kind of broadly speaking?
Yeah, that's really, you know, that's a difficult question to answer, because Native people are so diverse that I can't say something like this is the best thing to do for a Native survivor. But I think one thing that you might want to know is if you do encounter a Native survivor, is that there's now a new 24-hour hotline for domestic violence and sexual assault that's called Strong Hearts Helpline. It's just Google it. It's a 1-800 number, and they also have texting options too, just like some of the other hotlines are going through, is creating those text options as well. What they did a few years ago is there's that National Domestic Violence Hotline that's been around for quite a while. They did some auditing and discovered that they just never had Native women calling that hotline. And so they decided to create their own. Some of my colleagues decided to develop a Native helpline, staffed by Native people who are trained well, and it's now 24/7. So if you're a counselor or a support person of any kind, and you're working with a Native person and you're not sure you can offer everything that that person might need just because you don't know the answers, you know, referring them to this hotline, not like, go away, don't come back to me, call the hotline, but to say, you know, there are Native people out there, and the hotline is also staffed with Two-Spirit people as well. That they might be a good place for an anonymous discussion about what it means to a Native victim and how he or she is experiencing the aftermath. So that would be one referral that you could offer if you don't feel that you're necessarily getting to where she needs to be or where he needs to be. And I think just asking polite questions like, you know, so, you know, where are you from? What's your tribal nation? And can you tell me a little bit about the things you're proud of in your culture? You know, kind of approaching it from a more positive impact. Because one of the challenges we have with my kind of presentation is people are thinking that, oh, Indian reservations must be terrible places to live. And, you know, why would anyone want to live in that kind of environment? And so to sort of counter that negative sentiment that people internalize, to say, you know, what are you proud about your culture? You know, are there activities or ceremony? Don't ask about ceremonies, but are there aspects of your culture that that you feel proud of that might put you back in touch with sort of thinking about, you know, how women should be treated or how men should be treated or children should be treated in our culture. And that opening that door, I think, as a non-native support person could go a long way as well, but it's really individual.
Thank you so much for sharing that and for expounding upon that that question by providing that resource.
Sure.
As I scroll through, so one question just came in, and it reads thusly: I found the punishment system amazing. I wonder whether there are any efforts to get back full territorial sovereignty within the reservations and restore the traditional justice systems fully. Is there any desire from the tribes? I'm not sure if it is feasible, but just wondering. The historical examples of alternative ways of crime punishment would be great to adopt by our quote unquote modern justice system, which imposes incarceration and or monetary compensation.
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that. Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, I trained to be a prosecutor a long, long time ago. I never ended up prosecuting, but as a rape crisis counselor, I sat through a lot of jury trials, and I thought, huh, I could do that a little better. But I never ended up going that route. But yes, there are alternative systems, and some have been going on the whole time. It's just that they don't have academics writing about them, you know. But I'll give you one example. So in the Navajo Nation, which is the largest reservation in terms of land base, and probably one of the top 5 in terms of population, they have always had a methodology for adjudicating crime and coming up with solutions that translates into English as peacemaking. And peacemaking is a no lawyer zone. So no lawyers allowed. It involves usually a medicine man, but it could be a medicine woman as well. Navajo tends to have spiritual practitioners be men. But you bring the parties together. Well, first of all, they also have a Western style court. So they have like the Navajo Nation tribal court, and then they have peacemaking. So they are different systems. And to move into peacemaking, both parties, in whatever the conflict is, if they both agree, they can go to peacemaking. And because I'm not Navajo and I've never been to a session, I don't know what it's like. But what I understand it to be is an opportunity to get some spiritual guidance on how to resolve the dispute, whether it's a probate matter or a child custody matter or juvenile delinquency or anything along those lines, where the goal is to make sure that everyone in that room, including family members, has an opportunity to talk and to talk about what the resolution might look like for them. And at that point, then when there's a decision made, it can go back into the Western court for enforcement. So let's say they decide, for example, there's a domestic violence case. A woman has 4 children and he's beaten her and he's left her children without food, etc. Bring to peacemaking, and the decision is made that he needs to pay child support and provide some more material goods. Well, it goes back, that decision then goes back to the Western court to enforce. So the decision is not made in the courtroom, but the Western court system does enforce those decisions. There's many other tribes that have similar things that they do. A lot of people have picked up on the English word peacemaking because it reflects their own cultural norms as well. And the other thing we see a lot of is kind of what some of the alternative therapeutic justice programs we've seen in mainstream America, like drug courts and veterans courts and things like that, that are not punitive, but are more designed to be therapeutic. And so we have tribes that are adopting those models as well.
Great, thank you so much. Tim or Robin, as I scroll through the chat, do you see anything else coming in?
Oh, looks like you got everything so far.
Okay. All right. I mean, I can talk to Sarah for hours. I love her work. So, but if anyone has any other questions or comments or I think things they want to share, you know, now's the time to unmute yourself and do so.
I just wanted to make another comment, just like this notion of savages and, you know, the real savages have, you're pointing out William Bartram, who never saw gender violence.
Mhm.
Yet, you know, the other images of whites, raping women, that was such an atrocious description of the individual, along with Columbus, and putting that in his journal. I'm the idea that the majority of rapes against Native Americans have been committed by others. It just just such that again, the just really horrifying. So I'm just making another comment, I guess.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people want to know what they can do. Okay, so here is how I would recommend. We need all the allies we can get. And because we don't make up very much of the population, around 2% of the American population is Native. And so if we don't have allies, we're not going to make changes. And it was really important that with VAWA 2013, when we got that slight Oliphant fix to allow the prosecution of non-Indians, we had lots and lots of non-Native organizations that supported that effort. And so you do have a role to play. I'll put you, the national organization that does the most work on this is the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, NIWRC.org. I think that's right. National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. So they're sort of a clearinghouse for gender-based violence in Indian country. And also, I always forget to mention the urban communities. that's where I grew up, but Wichita is as urban as it gets. What's great about social media, right? I've quit social media personally for a short break, but is that organizations like NIWRC will, you can follow them on social media, you can sign up for their newsletter, and when there's legislation pending and they need people to call their lawmakers, their representatives from different states, and urge them to vote in favor of these bills, especially if you come from a state where there are no tribes, right? Because those senators and representatives don't have Native people as constituents and may not even, they may not even notice this problem or be aware of this problem. And so if you sign up for the tweets and the Facebooks and all of the other things, they oftentimes will even give you the draft speech, the draft language that you should use when you call or write. So you don't even have to come up with it. They've already created the Twitter storm, and you can just, recycle those and try to get the word out. There's also a lot of state Native coalitions. So for instance, like in Minnesota, there's a coalition called the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition, called MUSAC, and they have the same kind of thing. If there's state legislation moving within Minnesota that would address Native issues within the state, they again are going to send out alerts, right, to let you know what's happening and how you can help. So, and I would just, again, if this is brand new to you and you want to be helpful, I think just doing a little more reading about the issue, learn more about these Native women's organizations, and as you learn more, you will learn the ways that you can help as well.
Thank you so much for that. I saw a couple of people have turned their cameras on, so I don't know if that meant that they had a question. Let's see,
I had a question, if I could jump in. I was curious what you think or what you hope for Deb Haaland's impact as Secretary of Interior. Do you expect her to have impact on this field, or what are your hopes?
I'm so hopeful. So Deb Haaland was one of the first Native women to be elected to Congress. in 2016. Was that the right year or 2018? I'm losing track. So there are 2 Native women, one from Kansas, my home state and my current state. And they were elected the same year. So we had 2 Native women. We'd never had a Native woman in Congress before, ever, ever, ever. So the 2 at one time seemed like double exciting. And then Deb Haaland, and she's from Laguna Pueblo in New Mexico, has been appointed by Biden to be the Secretary of the Interior. Now, there have been a lot of Native people who have headed the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but that BIA is a much lower level agency than the entire Secretary of Interior. So she's not just involved in Native issues, she's going to have say in energy development and national parks, and all of those kinds of things now fall under her purview. She really understands this issue. She's, a politician, so she's not worked as an advocate necessarily, but she understands this issue. And I testified in front of her a couple of years ago when she was trying to start something as a congresswoman. But she's already announced a missing and murdered Indigenous peoples task force within the Department of Interior to try to stimulate more attention to unsolved cases, cold cases in Indian country. And I know there's more that she wants to do. So I have very high hopes, and I know she feels a lot of pressure from folks to get this right. And so I hope we can give her opportunities to make mistakes along the way and still understand what she has to offer. And it's truly amazing. And I'm just so beside myself with glee that we have a Native person in the cabinet. So high hopes.
Great. So that looks to be the last of our questions that we have. Any last words from you, sir, that you want to leave our audience with?
Well, I just posted my email address. I will share the PowerPoint with anybody who's interested. And I'm not on social media now. I'm taking a break, so you can't follow me on Twitter anymore because I'm not there. But yeah, you can certainly email me if you have questions, if your students have questions. I am on a 2-year sabbatical right now, so it takes me a few days to get back to people. If you have students that have particular questions, just know that I may take a little while to get back to you. So yeah, certainly the PowerPoints, the email, and any, if you have anything at all that you want to discuss with me, or if you disagree with me, if you have a different take on something, I'm always interested in expanding my knowledge as well. So don't hesitate.
Great, thank you so much. Now I also just dropped in my email address into the chat as well. And so if folks need the link for the recording, or if they want the PowerPoint, or if it's something here that you didn't quite record down and I need to somehow get you to say, I can necessarily do that. At this point, we are going to thank Sarah for her time and her energy and for her passion and for her expertise. For those of you that are Caldwell affiliated, be sure to engage with us on April 30th when we're going to celebrate Denim Day, our own rendition. We have some social media stuff going on that day, so hope that you'll engage with us with that. Again, this has been our keynote event and lecture for Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and so we're excited that Sarah was here to deliver some knockout information for us. Well, not knockout information, but I think you know what I mean, in a knockout capacity. So happy Friday, everyone. Hope everyone has a great weekend. Thanks again so much for being with us and spending some of your day with us. We hope you all are well and safe and healthy. And again, thank you so much for Sarah for being here with us and spending some time with us today.
Yeah, thank you very much. And hopefully one day I'll get to visit all of you in person.
Yes, I hope so too.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you again. Nice to meet all of you.
Bye, everybody.
Okay, goodbye.